My name is Anat Admati. I'm a finance and economics professor, so you might wonder why I'm moderating a panel on the topic of media and the disinformation ecosystem. And in fact, I wrote a book that's about banking, but at the end of the book, we talk about mention a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And now in my talks, I talk about a book named On Bullshit. And the Amusing Ourselves to Death book, written first in 1985, was complaining that cable television and talk radio was making discourse nonsense, our political discourse, and amusing ourselves to death is like Huxley, we're going to get too confused to have a society or something. And things have escalated, obviously, since then in the media ecosystem, something to do with news and knowledge and politics and democracy. And so that's what we're here to discuss. And we have an amazing panel of experts on this topic. And we're going to go through a few rounds of questions with the panelists. I'll introduce them. Guy Rolnik has a rich experience in the media sector going from before social media and can speak to the arc of where we are in the media ecosystem. And he's not a clinical professor at Booth School of Business. Why don't we actually start? I'll introduce them as they speak in this order for the first question. Guy, why don't we start with discussing by all three of you and starting with you, sort of where we are in today. In particular, focus now less on institutions and governance, but more the experience of the individual and the harms. I should note that versus the best of times narrative, we know that digital communication and media can connect us to our friends more easily and can create communities for us online. But we're going to take here the perspective more of society as a whole, of democracy, and of harms and what people can do about them or institutions can do about them. So there'll be this, what's the problem and how we're going to do about it, rather than, rah-rah technology in this panel, at least. Guy.
Yeah, so I wouldn't go as far as say that we are in the worst of time when we talk about our information ecology, but if I use your opening remarks about amusing ourselves to death, so Neil Postman, one of the most important media theorists, wrote in 1980.
That's the book I'm referring to.
Yeah. So Neil Postman wrote that we will amuse ourselves with death. He was warning us mostly from television that made politics and civic discourse into entertainment and spectacle. But he had a very interesting observation that I think, and prescient conversation that I think we should all carry with us all the time. Remember, when we look at the world that we live in today and the information ecology, he says, George Orwell wrote that the main fear, the main danger, the main threat to freedom and to our democracy is that government will censor us, okay? And Aldous Huxley, 30 years earlier, they were contemporaries, but Huxley wrote his book like 30 years earlier, warned that actually there will be no need for governments actually to censor books or newspapers because we will be totally distracted in this new world. And this is, and in many ways, although Orwell is much more popular in culture, it was Huxley that was right. And we live in a world that we swim in this world where we are constantly distracted by these machines, and we know we're going to talk about how those algorithms work. We live in a world where the companies, for-profit companies that control much of dissemination of information in the world, don't have any incentives to amplify and prioritize quality information. And Anat and I have been, up until 10 years ago, we've been discussing all the flaws of the traditional news media, how powerful entities capture them and sway them and bias them through all sort of way. And I dedicated a long period of my career at looking at the flaws of traditional media. But traditional media, at the end of the day, most of the traditional media had business incentives, legal incentives, reputational incentives, ethical incentives to look for the truth and to develop methods for inquiry of the truth. This is not where today. The entities that control all the information that we consume, all our information diets, have no incentives whatsoever. So to summarize everything, I think that history will say that that we are now in the moment of the worst epistemic crisis that we ever had in the last 3, 4, 5 generations.
Well, focusing on social media and exactly, we still have traditional media. If they have an app online, that's still New York Times or the news media that's still there. But the social media part of it, where a lot of young people get their information and where information is curated completely differently than traditional media with all its flaws and incentive issues, is the subject, has been the focus of Renee DiResta, who wrote a book called Invisible Rulers, people who make false
lies into
reality. And she was here in the Internet Observatory, Stanford Internet Observatory, which has been closed. And she's now in Georgetown as a research professor and continues to research the issues at the heart of this, specifically social media and democracy and people. Renee.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've really seen is a shift from obviously top-down to bottom-up opinion formation. The wonderful thing about social media is it does give more people voices, it does enable more conversations, as we mentioned, but the other side of it is, of course, that you start to see a lot of content creators in particular catering to a very specific niche, right? So you have to build your audiences and niches on social media, which means that rather than trying to appeal to a broad segment of the public, you appeal to a very narrow segment and you build an audience through there. And one of the things that you start to see happen as a result of that is the phenomenon of things like audience capture, where even the content creators and the audiences, it's very challenging for a content creator to maintain an independent perspective if they risk losing their audience. So you don't see necessarily the type of independent broad appeal that centralized broadcast media channels sought to have. Instead, you see this movement to opinion formation happening very in real time through the relationship between the influencer and their audience, the influencer and the crowd. And that, of course, then is mediated by algorithmic content curation and recommendation. So whereas in broadcast media, everybody would see roughly the same thing, the other side effect of the influencer creating content on social media is that they're not only creating for a human audience, they're constantly creating for an algorithm as well. So referencing media theory, you see things like the notion that that content follows the rules that the platforms have set. You start to see people shift not only their opinions, but the structure and the style of their content because they have to play that algorithmic curation game. We see platforms increasingly moving to a model that you might call the TikTok model, where rather than seeing the content that you have elected to follow in your feed, you're increasingly seeing what's called unconnected content. It's up to about 46% on Facebook at this point, where increasingly you are seeing things that an algorithm decides you might serendipitously like. So even if a content creator manages to maintain a relationship with an audience, manages to appeal to a niche, they still have to be playing that algorithmic game constantly because there's no guarantee that their content is going to be pushed out to their audience if an algorithm decides that something else is better to rank in the feed. So you see users who are not necessarily aware of just how much their information environment is curated for them, and also don't necessarily understand or are not fully cognizant of the incentives for the influencers and the content creators, which are decidedly different than the incentives of media. And I think the other book that I think is very relevant to the moment that was written 50 years ago now is Daniel Boorstin's The Image. The idea that there's this constant prevalence of pseudo-events, moments that are turned into scandal, moments that are turned into big deals, the main character of the internet, which are actually quite small, quite irrelevant, really. But because of the algorithmic incentive structure, People are constantly being fed and fighting over things that we would not have considered news in a prior media environment.
And then we have Alexandra Geese, who came all the way from Brussels, where she's a member of the European Parliament, hailing from Germany. And the environment, as we'll get to also later when we talk about governance issues, is a bit different there. And they're very attuned to the impact of this environment on individuals and their rights and powers and all of that, and have done more on this topic too, which we'll get to. Alexandra, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I would like to pick up where Renee left it off, and I really loved the title of her book, Invisible Rulers. I slightly disagree. I take a little bit of different notion. I think that these rulers are very, very visible. I mean, they have first names and last names, which are very well known. They live in this area. You know who these people are. Because they are the ones who decide on the incentive structure of social media. They decide the design. I mean, that is not a coincidence, something, abstract, falling from heaven or God-given. It's not. It's defined by a company, by people in that company. You can't hear me.
We need the mic, yeah.
Should I start over? Keep it a little bit closer, I think so.
No, there's no magnification. Can you
Maybe another
fix
mic?
her mic, please?
Okay. You went to get another mic.
Oh, another mic. Okay. Well, how about the following? We'll come back to you, and we'll go back to Guy, who...
This is like social media. Someone decides who to amplify, who are going to amplify, who are going to suppress.
Well, his voice is well amplified.
Yeah. And I'm already amplified because I have this voice. So
He has a strong voice.
Yeah. There you go.
That was quick.
It's a demonstration.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Okay, back to Alexandra, sorry.
That's proof it wasn't censorship of the Brussels politician. Should I start over? Did you get what I said, or should I start over? Okay. I wanted to pick up where Renee left it, and I love the title of her book, Invisible Rulers. I just slightly disagree because I think the rulers are extremely visible. They live in this area, they have companies in this area, they have first names and last names that you are very familiar with, because they are the ones who decide what the incentive structure for content creators is. And it's very easy to describe, and I learned that term last week from an American, actually, from Governor Cox of Utah, and he said it's rage reward and the division dividend. This is what is being rewarded. It's not only catering to specific audiences where we can say, well, I have particular interest. I'm quite happy to finally have a content creator that caters to my needs. No, the incentive is always the same. It's negative emotions. It's rage, outrage. It's hate. It's fear. That is what it is. And that also means when you boost that kind of content, and everybody of you who is a content creator, try, it works. It's very easy. I'm a politician, I do create content, and I know what I have to do to make a video go viral. I don't always want to do that. But I can testify to the fact that there's a very strong incentive to do polarizing content. If I attack someone in the beginning of my video, I'm sure it's going to go more viral than when I give may be interesting, but not aggressive explanation of what I'm actually doing. There's a very clear incentive structure, but these rulers are extremely visible. And boosting that kind of content is not only a huge problem for democracy, because what you need in a democracy is a community that shares facts and that is able to talk to each other. So if the content that is most boosted and that is most successful in terms of monetization and in terms of visibility, which is the currency of politics, is divisive, polarizing content, people would stop talking to each other. And I think in this country, you know something about that. We in Europe do as well. So I think that is the first problem. Then there's a second issue. I often in Europe, when we say, we have regulation, we would like to deal with this differently. And then some certain Americans, for example, the vice president, come over to you and say, well, this is censorship. Well, I don't think so. I think if content that does not try to get the rage reward, that does not try to play into the division dividend, is systematically downranked, because that's the other side of it. Some content gets boosted and the other one becomes invisible and sits there with 100 likes. Isn't that a form of modern censorship? I mean, you can still say whatever you want to say, but nobody's going to see it, and these rulers are going to make sure that happens. So I think that is what we should be discussing. There's no such thing as there's no rules. It's just freedom. There's always rules. The question is who is making the rules?
Very good. In fact, one thing that will become clear is the US has the most extreme form of freedom and anti-government speech environment where, you know, for the most part, there's free speech, so people can say. And then, of course, the impact of that speech, well, it's to be figured out. And then the power to curate the speech and put it in front of you, again, to be figured out, versus Europe that has free speech. So we're still in democracies. We don't have the environment of autocrats controlling the media and cutting you from the internet and all of that we see in some countries. So we're still pretty much moving between Europe and the US here. But in Europe, there are other ways. They don't have a First Amendment, and they don't have immunity to internet-only creators, not to regular media, but this Section 230 of the Communication Act, 1996, exempts media, internet companies from any liability for content, which is why what you see like in a late trial right now is more about product liability, about the way the algorithms work, you can addict somebody, versus any content that is actually shared. But the content also can matter, and we know that content can harm, so then now we come to the fuzzy rules. So what content is okay, and what happens when content is bad and harmful to individuals. So Guy, why don't you kind of get us into this, scams and harms and...
Yeah, so first of all, we're going to talk about the proposal and regulation. The problem that we have is not with deciding making choices about content. This is, Renee and Alexandra said, it's about the design of the system. The current architecture favors and prioritizes and pushes and amplifies and spreads a specific kind of content, mostly the content that is less and less compatible with any democratic civic discourse. Now, this is a room with people from all over the world, and when you speak with people about their politics in their countries, you hear from most of the countries in the rich world, in the OECD, all ranting about what happened to politics in the last 10 or 15 years. As you said that we are still a democracy. It's not entirely true. As you know, there are 3 or 4 leading research centers that measure actually the robustness of democracy. And as you know, the United States was downgraded to be electoral democracy for the first time last month. And this is the overall trend. And then when you start digging and asking people all over the world, at what point do you think that politics really started to get so worse? Most of the answer that I get, and I talk with a lot of people all over the world, is somewhere anywhere between 10 and 15 years ago. And I hear it from my students from India, and I hear it from students from Europe and Latin America and Brazil and Germany, all over. And of course, US and the Middle East and Israel, everywhere you hear the same thing. And the question, what happened in those years? And the answer is, building on what Renee said, that this is the year that 3 companies here, not very far, it's probably like 5 miles, I don't know, decided they're going to change the algorithm because they find out that actually the real benefit of targeting is not only for ads that you target among using surveilling, you target people. Actually, you target people the content according in their organic feed. And that has turned out, it's not only about misinformation, disinformation. What happened is that it rewired our minds and our brains and who we are. There is numerous studies from psychology and sociology and any discipline you can think how we have rewired society. Okay, nobody decided that we want to rewire society in this way. I think it's a way that is, as I said, incompatible with democracy. Those decisions were made by basically 4 and 5 companies. So it's building on what you said, Anat. So when it's easy to see so many individual harms, okay? Scams and frauds that are part of the business model, okay? Jeff Horowitz, investigative reporter that published the Meta files 3 or 4 years ago, using the whistleblower Frances Haugen, basically brought all the documents in the Wall Street Journal that showed that actually Meta knew exactly what they were doing. And there were a lot of people inside Meta that says we're not gonna, complaining that we are not only building what Alexandra said, we are not only changing the rhetoric, the language, the style, the culture, but of politics, we are also changing the platforms. Politicians need to change their positions in the platforms because of this algorithm. So recently, like 6 or 7 months ago, we had another leak from inside Meta that actually says that something like to the tune of $18 billion, 18 billion with a B, of the revenues of Meta are fraud. So fraud is part of the business model. And let me tell you, I have a lot of whistleblowers inside those companies that they can tell me that they can get rid of much of that fraud like this with simple policy, with simple decisions. But they have no incentives in doing it. They are making money off the scams and of the fraud and of the impersonation. So we waited enough, 10 years, 20 years, for them to get their act together. And it's clear that they don't care about the backsliding of democracy all over the world. And now is the time for people like Alexandra to step forward and to make sure that we have laws in the book about how do they design their architecture. And just to be clear, people forget the history. Throughout history, the technology of communication always defined who we are as societies. What's our politics? It was all the same. You want to understand society and politics, you need to understand the technology of communication. Every time that we had a technological shock, okay, it first caused, like we have today, it caused chaos. And then institutions and parliaments and laws reacted. We as a society reacted and we put guardrails and we created institutions and norms. Now we are in the midst of the most profound, deep, powerful technological shock in communication that we've ever witnessed, and it happens so fast, okay, the penetration of those machines into our life, and we're not responding. Why? We're going to talk about power later, because this time, this shock is controlled, those machines are controlled only by a handful of companies that have immense political power.
Okay. Renee, why don't you describe to us some of the dynamics between the institutions at the, at the intersection of these companies? You were, studying from the outside. People are, as some of these whistleblowers and the people who work there every day, and, they used to work in trust and safety, or which again were dismantled. How are the institutions responding, and what has evolved, especially in the US where your experience is?
So in the US, it's very, it's interesting because in Europe, there are laws that allow researchers to have data access and things like that. We don't have that here. And so that means that a lot of the access that we did have was just granted because it was nice. It was a nice thing to do for a while. Public sentiment, particularly after 2016, and after the realization that Russia, for example, the Internet Research Agency, had leveraged the platforms to run influence operations for years without being found or disrupted, led the platforms to create what they called integrity teams internally, and then to build some transparency tools that they gave access to researchers and to journalists. When I was at Stanford Internet Observatory, which we started in 2019, and the head, Alex Stamos, who started it, had come out of Facebook. He'd been the CISO at Facebook, and his story there is very interesting. The New York Times has covered it and stuff. He kind of had a bit of a war with the company about making public exactly what had happened with Russian interference and things like that. I was an outsider researching it for the Senate on the outside, so we had sort of a different perspective of what this looked like. But for a while there, starting in around, I would say 2019, you started to have actually quite open channels of communication, particularly for finding foreign interference, particularly for looking at influence operations. And as Guy mentions, anytime you have a media shift, anytime you have a technological shift, propagandists and scammers are the two kind of entities that go for it first, right? You have propagandists wanting to get a message out there. ISIS becomes one of the most visible entities on social media, on Twitter in particular for a while there. You see Russia and China begin to adopt it much more surreptitiously. Iran also comes in, does the same thing. It becomes almost table stakes to interfere in your geopolitical adversaries' politics, and then also among autocratic regimes to manipulate the political discourse within your own country, sometimes through harassment, sometimes through disinformation, sometimes just through propaganda. So this overt to covert spectrum that you see play out on social media. And so we had these open channels of communication because we would see things sometimes at SIO. One example that comes to mind is the Wagner Group, which I think most people here probably are familiar with. It was Yevgeny Prigozhin's paramilitary organization. They operated in theater in Africa. They began running influence operations in Libya. They had a lot to say about Libya. And one day we said, there's no way this is authentic. Libyans are not talking about Maxim Shugeli, who is a Russian who was arrested in Libya. And we sort of looked at that collection of accounts that were pretending to be Libyans talking about Shugeli, and we reached out to Twitter and to Facebook because at that point we had those open channels of communication. And we said, this is what we're seeing. What do you think this is? Because we can't make an attribution on the outside. We can only say this is what we think. This is our best guess based on behavioral indications, based on plausibility, based on the type of content. Sometimes you get a little bit in the way of indications that they are linked to a particular domain, and you can do domain forensics there. But it is very hard as an outsider to make a concrete attribution. The platforms, however, have device identifiers. They have cookies. They know where people are. They have the email or phone number or device that the account was registered with. So you had these open channels of communication that allowed us to do this kind of research. And that went quite well for years, actually. Those channels of communication, they were never regulated here, though, and that's why what I'm going to say next is that that was always done as just a nice to have. You can have data access provided you're a vetted researcher, but when it became a political liability, when the House flipped in 2022 and Jim Jordan got the gavel of the Weaponization Committee, and all of us started getting subpoenaed. And then all of a sudden, Jim Jordan sends an email demanding the last 10 years of my communication with all tech platforms and the executive branch of the United States government to search for the Biden censorship regime. And that creates a profound chilling effect. So even when we were talking to platforms about child safety, about, hey, here are accounts that are committing child exploitation, we had so many different issues that we talked to them about. Because again, it was always just an open channel of communication. They didn't have to do anything we told them. We didn't have to do anything they told us. But there was this discourse. Once those subpoenas come down and all of your emails are turned over to Congress, those communications stop because it is a legal liability for everybody at that point. And so that was the effect. And what you see is the platforms responding to the changing political winds and then the re-election of Donald Trump by dismantling communication infrastructure, data transparency. Twitter starts charging $40,000 a month for its API, which used to be free, these sorts of things. And so that is how our ability to understand the information ecosystem in the United States really begins to disintegrate at that point.
Yeah, so a lot of chilling came about from all of this, outing, doxing undergrad students at Stanford, all kinds of things right here even, which, Renee and others at Stanford experienced. Alexandra, come tell us about Europe and your observations.
Well, about the intersection of people's experience and how regulation and government comes in, I think there's one interesting story that you're probably familiar with. But I'd like to tell you what the impact is right now in Europe, because I think that is really interesting, and there's some good news in it as well. You probably all have watched when Elon Musk activated a functionality on X over Christmas of all times, and then the first days of January. That was called, that allowed basically Min to use Grok spicy mode, to create, that's what it's called, sexualized images of women and children. And in 11 days, according to the New York Times, 3 million pictures of women were created and 23,000 sexualized images of children. Which is, I don't know if everybody is familiar with this, but I have worked with victims and victims organization of deepfake sexualized images. I've been doing that for 5 years. I'm still very frustrated about how little progress we had made before. And it is basically a very similar impact to physical sexual violence, the kind of fallout that people deal with. So 3 million cases in 11 days, not to speak of the children. Now what happened? I mean, it's very clear that Europe has a Digital Services Act, and there's an article says, well, if a platform creates a systemic risk for a number of things, and among them gender-based violence, it has to take mitigating measures, and the Commission can basically make it do so. So this was basically the impersonation of that case. And the technical level of the European Commission that implements the digital services actually took action, and they came up with an investigation. This is how it works. You have to come up with an investigation, and then you ascertain the facts, and then you come with a fine. And they had an investigation ready on Friday. And on Monday, it was delayed because it was the Davos week. And President Trump had threatened Europe with invading Greenland. And so the Commission president wanted Donald Trump to be in a good mood, and so she delayed that investigation. This is a true story. It was reported by a German newspaper, Handelsblatt. And the investigation then came a week later after there was agreement and the president promised not to invade Greenland militarily. So think about the damage done to these women and to these children, because these pictures are never going to go away. They stay on porn platforms, they stay in the internet, they come up again and again and again. And these pictures will be out there in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. You know, when these children grow up, their pictures are still somewhere out there, just because it was delayed by a week. Now this investigation is ongoing. That was January. Have you heard about results? I haven't. You know, that is what happens right now. One good thing, to give some good news, this made sort of the European Parliament, and I have to admit I had some kind of role in that, spring into action. And a couple of weeks ago, before Easter, we managed to pass a ban for apps that create only deepfake sexualized images, and AI systems that create all kinds of images, but they can also be used for that, have to take a number of measures and safeguards to make sure that people don't use them that way. And this is probably, I don't have a clear timeline because we have a very complicated legislative process in Europe, but it's probably coming with the AI omnibus for some of you who are maybe familiar with our kind of legislation. So it's going to enter the AI Act if everything goes well. So there will be a hard stop to that kind of images.
Yeah. So we're gonna go one more round before opening up for questions about what are the tools, and we sort of got a little bit started just to say on sexualized images that there was one development that may have gone unnoticed in the U.S. We actually had President Trump sign the Take Me Down Act, which actually was lobbied by a young high school kid who was nudified by some of these AI-generated ability to take your clothes off and post it online, where they have to take it down, actually, because there is nothing compelling them to take down content that is completely false or very, very harassing. So we got that far. But when it comes to any kind of regulation, and I've had many people, say that failing to, put some kind of constraints or at least transparency requirement or other ways for us to evaluate what social media companies do has been a huge mistake, and we're trying to catch up with it in various ways. So I want our panelists to advance some steps that can be taken by individuals, by companies, by governments, to kind of improve our information environment. The book that I wrote, which ends about the media, we were like, how are we going to end the book that says, there's no political will to reform the financial system or whatever? We ended it by saying that we we need to start by giving truth more power. Now that's very cute because instead of talking truth to power, you want to give truth power. But that's very complicated. What is truth? How do you give it power, in a world of free speech and these media? So, that's a cute expression. But down on the ground, as we talk about democracy and how media and communication affect it, let's hear some ideas for what we should be doing as a sort of to move forward.
Yeah, so I'll start with building up on what Alexandra said about the Elon event. So I'm not a lawyer, but I guess that if some publisher that is not a social media platform would create and publish and spread these kind of images, the legal consequences will be very severe and maybe ends up in jail. But of course, everything that is not allowed in the real world, if you're doing it on X or on Instagram or on TikTok, you are totally exempted and it's fine, although these companies do it. So the harms that were in the old world, you can do, and most publishers had reach of hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people, and we're talking about now harms that reach billions of people in a much more aggressive and nasty way because it targets everyone according to the information we collected about you for the past 10 years. So I think we need to move at least in 5 main directions when it comes to policy proposal. The first thing is accountability and responsibility. With great power, and these companies have more power than any corporations in the history of the world, inability to manipulate and opinion and shape opinion, basically control politics around the world. So I met 6 or 7 years ago, I met Reed Hundt. He was the chairman of the FCC when the FCC brought the Section 230 into the 1996 Telecommunication Act. And I asked him, what were you thinking? And I thought he's going to be very defensive and says, Section 230 also created the internet, brought a lot of things, freedom and so. And basically he said, no, we were wrong. We were naive. We didn't see where it's going. Okay, and this is the person who wrote those laws. So we need to understand that platforms are publishers, and they are publishers that reach billions of people, and they should have responsibility for all the harms created. They are not neutral, they are not dumb pipes, they are not the infrastructure, they are not the telephone. They are the people who decide what speech gets million views and what speech disappears, and who gets that speech. So number one, we have to have responsibility and accountability. Number two, which is sort of obvious, we don't need to give free speech or any protections for bots or for troll farms, okay? In banking, the most obvious thing is your customer, okay? You don't want your customer to turn out to be a terrorist group. We need to have know your customer, know your users on the platforms. Immediately we get rid of all those CIBs, they are coordinated inauthentic behavior networks. We don't want Russia to interfere in the election by building farms of trolls that work and bots that are working in tandem, okay? This can be done very fast. Those companies have profits of hundreds of billions of dollars. They should be able to stop and identify all the bots that are on and the fake accounts and so on. The third step is, of course, we will not have a democracy and we will not have sovereignty in any country if there are 2 or 3 companies that have granular information and build psychological and political profiles on the entire population, on the voters. And they have it for years. They've been collecting that information. We need to stop them from collecting this information and building profiles on billions of people and knowing exactly in each county, in each country, where the swing votes were. Because we know that with this information, basically, you can rig the entire political system. The fourth step should be sovereignty. In most countries around the world, those companies operate from here, from the Bay Area, but they change politics and they rewire societies all over the world. And in most countries, it's very difficult to sue them or hold those people. They sue us in Dublin. No, not in Dublin. Go to that. Go there. Go to California. California has those laws. And actually, so we need to make sure that wherever they operate according to the local laws, and they have directors that are accountable to the local legal system, because if they ruin our society, we need to be able to sue them. And the last thing is obvious. Finally, everybody's starting to agree on it. When we look back, we'll think, why did it take us some time? We should, age gate those platforms. They started in Australia. They're moving to Europe. Some states here are trying to do it. The idea that we let our kids being manipulated by those addictive, harmful machines for the last 10 years, and people like companies like Instagram, they made everything they can in order to make those machines more and more addictive. Well, the harms is clear. We see what happened to mental health problems in this country since they changed the algorithm. So we should make sure that we don't let them drink alcohol or drive and do a lot of things when they're 18 or 21. We cannot have them being manipulated by those machines. And everyone that has knows this generation can see they are suffering. They are suffering from those machines, and we need to intervene fast. So we need to start there because this is the lowest hanging fruit, because everybody sees the harm, and then move to all the other change of architecture that will save our democracies.
Okay, Renee is a little more, power of the individual than government.
Because, look, I've been in this space now for 13 years. The United States is not going to pass a law. It's just not. So no, it's not. I believe in being pragmatic. I do. And I know that everybody introduces like, we're going to do this to CDA 230 or that to CDA 230. Nothing passes. So in light of that, the argument I am making is that actually the areas that we should be looking are not content related at all, but rather things like mandating transparency. First of all, you can pass that quite easily. That is not a content related, speech related. There are the First Amendment concern that you will hear sometimes is that transparency is compelled speech. But in areas where there is a high risk of harm or there is a significant detriment, this is why you have nutrition labels on your food. There is an argument that compelled speech can actually be just fine. So I'm a big supporter of transparency regulation. I believe that it should be passed, and it can be tacked on to other types of social media bills and other types of bills as well. The other thing, though, is there has been a rise of more platforms. There are more platforms in the world. There's protocols like AT protocol, which is what Blue Sky is built on, that enable people to build their own social architecture. There's been the rise of a great community called Black Sky that uses AT protocol to build a social network specifically for a community with very particular moderation needs and desires, and it works to create an environment for that community. It's actually fairly inexpensive to do it. And so I think that what you need to see, though, is interoperability. You need to have the ability to take your profile, take your data, take your content, and move it from one platform to another. Because even though we're seeing the rise of these newer platforms, the thing that keeps people from using them is the feeling that, all of my other stuff is here, all of my friends are here. It's too much of a heavy lift to go to these other places. And so I do think that that's the other area where it's actually remarkably bipartisan, the argument that we should not allow 5 companies to dominate the discourse. So using market-based solutions to enable people to leave is another area that does not in any way touch on content or First Amendment rights. And so that's another area that I think is very much worth investing in.
Yeah, well, I think some of what Guy is talking about has to do with privacy or has to do with other things. But anyway, let's hear final comments, and then we want to move to questions from Alexandra.
Yeah, I totally agree with Renee's last point in particular. This is something I'm trying to support in Europe, where we have a particular interest, obviously, in building our own social media systems. And I really like what the atmosphere, so the world around AT protocol is doing in Europe, and we're trying to create a basically common infrastructure for local app developers, local founders to already have that infrastructure in place to take the really expensive parts of the infrastructure. Content moderation is an expensive part, which came as a surprise to me when I learned that. Yeah. But that is so, because we have all these products and they're great. They just have difficulties scaling because in Europe we have less capital, and that is an area where it's very difficult to find investment. So this is what we're looking at. I think that there's a great hunger right now for that kind of really social media, more community-based, where you can make choices around what kind of moderation do you want to have as a user. So I think that is a really, really promising avenue. And I also think in cooperation with traditional media who are seeing their business model basically going away because of the advertising system and AI basically keeping people from going to their websites and generating revenues, I think that is an area where it becomes possible to overcome these network effects. Because if a traditional TV channel, for example, comes to one of these new social media, they bring 100 million users very quickly, and then you can scale up. So I do see a window there to do that, and that is one part of where I focus my work to support that. The other one is still, we have legislation, fortunately, we're just not implementing it because of the geopolitical circumstances, to say it diplomatically. I love coming to the US, so, but I'm I think I also get invited because I can still speak very openly. I still have a great amount of freedom of speech, and I use it. But what I would like you to think about is to have a different paradigm in terms of freedom of choice. Because I think what we should give users back and citizens back on the internet is freedom to choose their content. And not in a complicated way. You know, the old digital rights scene says, well, you need to have a chronological timeline. Nobody wants a chronological timeline. I mean, the interesting thing about social media is that it's tailored to me. But I don't want a company to have all my data and on the basis of my comment or click behavior to say, well, that is your preference, what they call the real preference. No, I want them to respect my real preference. I want them to be able to say, I like cats and I like horses and I like that kind of political content and put a doctor show or something in there. And that's my algorithm. Or let's say, I really love my public broadcaster in Germany. I trust them to do my news algorithm. There's so many creativity out there. And a lot of people are the people who work in these companies, who come from the trust integrity teams, who have really great ideas. And how you can shape an algorithm, you can give freedom back to the users. And I think that is the most important thing. Because what the companies are telling us is engagement is people making choices. It is not. Engagement is basically means what does our brain engage with? Our brain is trained to protect our body. So we deal with aggression. Everything that attacks, that becomes dangerous, this is what we engage with. And take that to the physical world. You're walking and there's people smiling at you, there's people just ignoring you. You're gonna engage because that is what they're supposed to do. And you just, do your own business. If I get attacked, walking outside, I engage because I have to defend myself. And that is exactly what happens in the internet. If I feel attacked, if I feel fear, if I feel rage, I think, well, these people are attacking me, are attacking my group, are attacking my social status, I react. But that is something how we are wired biochemically. It's not a conscious choice. So giving people the conscious choice back to say with a few, easy questions, this is what my algorithm should look like, or this is the person I trust, the third-party provider, this is the organization that I trust with my algorithm, and then I can easily change it. I think that is a way to give freedom back and to solve a lot of problems without touching on any kind of legal content, and that's the way we should go. It's a different paradigm, but I think this is where we could get, and in Europe, we could have the legal basis to actually do that. And I think there's a lot of countries out there, like Canada, like Australia, who would be very interested in participating in that kind of experiment.
Okay, we're going to conclude here our part of it and let you ask more questions. We have, 10, maybe 12, 13, however much we're allowed to go. Yes?
Thank you for hosting this. So China recently voted to approve that only people...
They're giving you a mic.
So China recently passed that only people with certain educational background certification can voice topics such as education and medicine. So for when they're doing content creation. So how do we, what's your take on this as we navigate eliminating like false notions, half-truths, but also not only enabling a privileged few to speak, and also the role of government in setting these kind of policies.
Yeah, so you were referring to expertise, and we didn't really go there in terms of, you know, who generates knowledge, right? I mean, they're trying to say only experts should speak on a topic. Now, of course, that's kind of a complicated area in terms of, you know, I'm an expert, but on some things. But experts, you know, sometimes can get, you know, distorted themselves. But it's true that, you know, you would say not everybody can just say whatever they want about topics in which they don't know. Maybe Renee can comment on this
the
because of the
influencer laws. The influencer laws is what you're talking about. It's an interesting. So first of all, you would never want that here, right? Because it's just. I would argue that you probably wouldn't want that here. Most Americans that will not. That first of all, it wouldn't ever clear First Amendment hurdles. It's just never going to happen. But more importantly, I think there is this argument that experts get things wrong. People will point you to COVID, right? The other thing, though, with that is you can do more. First of all, to help expert voices get elevated, right? So that's one, which was something that actually Twitter was doing during COVID. They were blue checking frontline physicians and trying to amplify them so that when people were saying COVID isn't real, it's not happening, you had these doctors saying, I'm in the morgue over here and let me tell you what is happening. So that is one approach. The other approach, though, which we're talking about with regard to middleware is the term for it, third-party providers that can add extra context, is that you can signal that certain accounts have more expertise, right? There was I don't know how many people remember this, but there was a product called Clout for a while. I see a couple of people nodding. It was a tool that you could indicate that you were scored kind of by your friends, but also by the algorithm that they had that would indicate that you had some expertise in a particular topic. So the argument would be if you were to search for that topic, that content would be upranked. So it's not saying people can't participate, right? They're still participating, but the question is what gets surfaced in curation, and that's where you start to see indications that certain voices may have more reputability.
Let's go to more questions. Over there. Oh, over there.
If you don't mind, this is kind of a personal question. Given your level of knowledge, what practices do you use within your own family, with your children or grandchildren, just as practice? And what would you recommend for the rest of us, for our children or grandchildren? But I'd like it to be real in terms of what you actually practice.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So let me tell you something. I get asked this question a lot. You know, I come to give a talk about how to redesign the architecture of social media, big tech, LLMs, and so on. And we talk about laws and regulation and history, and then people I want something concrete. What do I do with my kids now? They won't let go the Instagram. So the first thing I tell parents when first of all, try to get rid of the guilt that you have. Because what I see is a lot of people think that they see their kids or someone, 8 hours a day on Instagram, and they feel it has to do with our parenting, it has to do with that, and so on. And first you need to remind people that are struggling with that how to take the phone from their teenagers. Is I always tell them, imagine that you are here and your kids are there, and you are trying to influence them to let go of YouTube or Instagram and TikTok. Remember, 50,000 people, the smartest people in the world, engineers, here in San Mateo, are standing between you and the kid, making sure that you will not be able to reach out to them and talk to them, okay? $15 trillion of market cap, that's the value of those companies, are stopping you actually in that. So the only way actually to deal with it is for us to come together as a society and says we don't want to have heroin dispensed in schools, okay? And we don't want our kids on Instagram. Now, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, so I don't want to say how to deal with one's children. I believe that it's very, very difficult because everyone is on Instagram and everyone is TikTok, and people feel that if they are not there, they will lose their position in society. And then there is this old story that you probably all know because we are in Stanford, the fact that the only people in the world that really don't allow their kids to be on the machines are the people who run those companies.
Question.
Thanks for the great panel. Government cannot control the creation of the content. It's unleashed, and it's going to get even worse with the power of AI. But they definitely can regulate the content creators. The panel alluded on a few applications that actually we've been using in my own company and nonprofit platforms. Proof of personhood, uniqueness, keeping the users anonymous while they are creating a scorecard like what we have for credit card systems, right? And it's industry standards or regulated regulations or whatever. What it takes for the governments or industry as a whole to create these standards that are really easy to place. We have developed them, so I know they exist, and regulate social media that, this user cannot have multiple accounts, has to be a unique, anonymous, so there's no bully then. They can actually openly talk about any opinions that they have. And people can see their scorecard. So this person has created this much of misinformation, disinformation. These technologies are out there. In fact, in Democracy 3.0, the platform, nonprofit platform that I've created, we're using all of this. But how we can make the governments to
Who do you have in
apply?
mind create the score?
Sorry?
Who do you consider?
Well, the way that we do it, the users can score each other.
Oh, it's
and
a
there
community
should be
score.
algorithms as well, like cloud numbers, right? That they can score all of these anonymous but unique human, right? And now we're shifting the entire industry towards being transparent, being honest. We stop astroturfing. We stop grassroots, basically fake grassroots, misinformation, disinformation. These technologies are out there, but what it takes for us to force social media and the governments to apply them.
Anybody? Renee?
And I know, I'm sorry, monetization, they all think that, that stops monetization, but there are many ways to create the other ways for monetization as well.
You can't make a company adopt a tool like that. You just can't. It's because this is, again,
Except by law.
Well, no, I would argue that you can't, because the problem is, in the United States, the First Amendment covers their right to curate and their right to moderate, and there's also CDA 230, which has a second order layer on that. This is to say that you have to create incentives for them to want to do it, for example, through public pressure. The public has to demand it, right? Which means they have to be able to see it and experience it, which is one reason why, again, I think things like AT protocol, where people are on Blue Sky and seeing what is possible, even if you don't like Blue Sky as a community or as an ecosystem, if it's like very, very left, and if you're not part of that community, maybe you want to be somewhere else, but still you can see this is what feeds look like, this is what labelers look like, here's how you can use that technology. You cannot compel a private company to do that sort of, to curate in a certain way in the United States. You just can't. So I think the other area, though, that you're referencing is incentives. The FTC regulates influencer disclosures right now. So they have to do more disclosing if they're trying to persuade you to buy a watch than they do if they're trying to persuade you to vote for a political candidate, because the FEC regulates their political communications. And so there's these dynamics that begin to take shape around not even necessarily who is speaking, but just who is being paid, who is incentivized to say certain things, why is an influencer pushing a particular political message. They don't have to disclose it. And that's where I think the government can come in, because the FTC already does regulate commercial speech. If the FEC had a spine, they would do it, but they don't want to, because neither party actually wants to be the one to pass that law, because they all benefit from it. And that is the answer. It's political will.
Oftentimes is where, there's sort of the First Amendment, which is only sort of a U.S. problem in terms of how much freedom it gives. Also, corporations to in the speech area, but there's also political will issues on the things that we can. Yeah. So I mean, Europe doesn't have as many constraints that way. So they are able to kind of think through what it is that they want to have happen, even though you want to give speech. Because I mean, when people characterize Europe here, and Alexandra could speak to it. They always say, oh, you're just censoring or something, and that's not what's happening. So can you speak for a minute on that?
Yeah, I think our time is running. I slightly agree with Renee that it's very hard to force a company to do that. Even in Europe, to say, well, this is a specific instrument, I think that is difficult. But what I see is really that people want that.
Yeah.
People are asking for that. And this is the discussion we have around anonymity or not anonymity, but I think that is exactly the solution, proving personhood. There's some countries like Norway, which is like number 2 or 3 of the freedom index of the world, of all institutions that research that every year. And they are looking into a way to say, I'm a citizen or not. Because, we all have this phenomenon, like the far right, really racist German party, and her president was called that her account is supported by 11,000 Nigerian. We don't know what kind of accounts, but they are located in Nigeria. And when X disclosed where people were, or accounts said, there was a very similar phenomenon in the U.S. So I think the hunger for real content and for real people on the internet, for authenticity, that is really something powerful. So trying to build a different universe that uses those systems, I think that is extremely attractive. And then I think the answer is maybe not very satisfying. It's about competition. It's about having a market where these companies can prosper without being killed right away. So, it comes a little bit from a different angle, but have a really strong competition law and a strong implementation, and making sure there is real competition and these companies can grow and have a different business model. I think this is really where it comes from. In terms of, since you said freedom, I think it is really interesting that the companies who say they're bringing freedom to people actually are linked to the autocratization of the world. And Guy gave the numbers before. It starts in 2011. Last year was record high. And the US fell from rank 20 to 50-something in 12 months. So this is what's happening when you see freedom only in terms of the rulers of these social media companies having the freedom to make the algorithms and to decide who is visible and who is not visible. I think the way to go is to give the freedom back to the citizens, back to the people, to really choose their content, to know who they're following, who they're listening to, and to really be able to interact socially. This is what, I'm and some more people in Europe are trying to do, but I would be really happy to do this together.
Well, we're going to end this panel. Thank you so much. This is a very challenging area.